Tariffs have become a major topic in economic discussions ever since Donald Trump took office, using them both as a negotiation tactic and a tool to address a range of economic concerns. His approach to economic nationalism takes inspiration from the 19th century, a time when tariffs were the defining feature of U.S. trade policy. This strategy is often credited with maintaining a zero-income tax while protecting domestic industries. So, if it worked for the U.S. in the past, could it work again today? At the very least, it's a question worth exploring, since tariffs offer the enticing possibility of boosting industrial revival while creating fiscal space to lower taxes. Even economists who strongly advocate for globalization acknowledge that, in certain cases, tariffs make economic sense. That's why rapidly growing economies like India, Brazil, and of course China continue to rely on them heavily. However, the world today is vastly different from when the U.S. last implemented tariffs at the scale currently being considered. Modern American consumers are used to affordable products sourced through complex global supply chains, which depend on minimal trade restrictions. New tariffs would disrupt these supply chains, potentially forcing businesses to hike prices just to stay afloat. In practice, this would make tariffs a disguised tax on consumers. Still, the potential benefits, such as increased employment and stronger domestic industries, could outweigh the downside of reduced consumer purchasing power. Naturally, the recent debate on tariffs has been highly politicized, but when it comes down to it, tariffs are simply an economic tool. Like a wrench, they aren't inherently good or bad. Need to tighten or loosen a bolt? A wrench is useful, but if you're performing brain surgery, you might want a different tool. The point is, broad, generalized statements about tariffs often oversimplify reality. Tariffs create different effects in different industries, so their overall impact depends on how they are structured. That means nuance is more important than ever. So, as always, we have some important questions to tackle. How do tariffs actually function? What can chickens and washing machines teach us about tariffs? And finally, why might tariffs still be worth considering even if they come with economic costs? Tariffs as an economic tool. A tariff is a tax applied to imported goods paid by domestic businesses that bring those products into the country. It falls under the broader category of protectionist economic policies or even economic nationalism. The basic logic behind tariffs is simple. By making imported goods more expensive, domestically produced alternatives become relatively cheaper. This encourages local production, creating jobs and investment opportunities while also generating government revenue. This strategy, known as import substitution industrialization, has been employed by various countries throughout history to protect and develop their domestic industries. Few nations, however, have had their economic trajectory shaped by tariffs as significantly as the United States. This makes its modern role as the champion of free trade somewhat ironic. In fact, the second ever law passed after the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1789 was a Tariff Act. Alexander Hamilton, yes, the same one from the Broadway musical, respected Adam Smith's free market economic theories but rejected the idea that unrestricted trade was universally beneficial. Hamilton recognized that while the U.S. had gained political independence from Britain, it wouldn't achieve economic independence until it developed its own manufacturing base. At the time, Europe was already in the midst of its industrial revolution, producing steel, textiles, chemicals, and machinery at scale. By comparison, the U.S. had fewer factories, less capital, and a smaller skilled workforce. Competing with European manufacturers under free trade conditions was nearly impossible. To counteract this disadvantage, the U.S. government introduced tariffs, making European imports more expensive and encouraging local entrepreneurs to start businesses on American soil. Throughout the 19th century, these tariffs continued to rise, with rates eventually exceeding 40% on key goods. And it worked. American industries boomed, tariffs funded 90% of the federal budget, and the government relied entirely on trade taxes. Income tax didn't even exist until the early 20th century. However, tariffs were controversial even then. While the industrial North benefited, the agrarian South suffered from retaliatory European tariffs on their cotton, tobacco, and sugar exports. By the time the Morrill Tariff was introduced, tensions were already high due to Lincoln's election and his anti-slavery stance. The tariff only added fuel to the fire, so the U.S. tariff debate is nothing new. Fast forward to the aftermath of World War II, and the U.S. took a completely different approach. With its industries now fully developed, the country pivoted towards free trade, seeking to lead the global economy. Advancements in transportation and communication made international trade more efficient, and nations began specializing in industries where they held a competitive advantage. It also helped that most global competitors had been bombed into oblivion during the war. This shift was solidified with the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995, which facilitated decades of tariff reductions. As a result, modern supply chains became more interconnected and complex, with final products often being assembled from parts made in dozens of different countries. For decades, free trade dominated economic policy. But that all changed in 2018, when the world's biggest free trade advocate imposed major tariffs on its largest trading partner. What recent tariffs teach us? To understand the real-world impact of tariffs, let's examine something familiar: washing machines. A study by economists at the U.S. Federal Reserve analyzed how tariffs introduced in 2018 affected washing machines. The findings were clear. Importers passed the costs on to consumers through higher prices. This also allowed domestic producers to raise their own prices, despite not even paying the tariffs themselves. Even worse, dryers, which weren't subject to tariffs, also became more expensive simply because they're often sold alongside washing machines. In simpler terms, the price increase outpaced the tariff itself, making it an inefficient and expensive tax on consumers. And this wasn't an isolated case. A 25% tariff on steel in 2018 made raw materials more expensive for countless American industries, including automotive, construction, and machinery. As a result, profit margins shrank, jobs were lost, and the net effect was negative for U.S. manufacturing as a whole. On top of that, countries like China retaliated, imposing tariffs on U.S. agricultural products, which hurt American farmers. To prevent widespread farm bankruptcies, the U.S. government spent $61 billion on subsidies, almost wiping out the $66 billion collected from tariffs. Essentially, tariffs brought in revenue on one side, but created costs elsewhere, making the fiscal benefit largely a wash. Are tariffs still useful? Despite their economic costs, tariffs can still be justified in certain industries, especially those with national security concerns. As global tensions rise, relying on geopolitical rivals for key resources is a major risk. Sectors like semiconductors, energy, transportation, and rare earth minerals are particularly vulnerable. If a crisis or conflict disrupts global supply chains, the inability to produce these goods domestically could pose a serious threat. At that point, the debate around tariffs shifts from economics to geopolitics. This is why many global powers are returning to protectionism after decades of free trade. If you want to learn more about this shift, please watch our next video about how to profit from a Trump presidency in 2025, where we explore how protectionism, nationalism, and geopolitical tensions are reshaping the global economy. You will see that video on your screen soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.